The last message was written in a tent that no one would reach for nearly 8 months. Outside, a blizzard erased the horizon. Inside, 3 men waited beside an almost empty food bag and the last of their fuel. Captain Robert Falcon Scott opened his diary and wrote a few final lines. He did not describe victory. He did not ask for rescue. He wrote that they would continue to endure, that they were growing weaker, and that the end could not be far. Then, beneath his name, he added one final request. For God's sake, look after our people. The page was dated March 29th, 1912. No one was there to read it. Scott, Edward Wilson, and Henry Bowers were still 11 miles from One Ton Depot, where food and fuel waited beneath a marker in the snow. Robert Falcon Scott. Edward Wilson, a physician, naturalist, and Scott's close friend. Henry Bowers, a naval officer known for his strength and attention to detail. Lawrence Oates, an Army officer responsible for the expedition's ponies. And Edgar Evans, an experienced Royal Navy petty officer. On January 17th, they saw something dark ahead of them on the ice. It was not a natural feature. It was a marker left by another expedition. The next day, they reached a small tent and found the record of Roald Amundsen's Norwegian team. Amundsen had already reached the South Pole more than a month earlier. Scott's party had completed the outward journey, but the goal they had imagined was gone. The diary from that day did not hide the disappointment. Scott understood that the return journey would now begin without the reward of being first. They turned north. Between them and Cape Evans lay roughly 800 miles of ice, glacier, wind, and carefully measured supplies. At first, the return appeared difficult, but possible. The men followed their earlier route. They aimed for the depots established on the journey south. At each one, they expected food, fuel, and a brief margin of safety. But the expedition began losing that margin. The weather became colder than expected for the season. Surfaces that had helped them on the outward journey now slowed the sledges. Wind pressed against them. Their physical condition declined. Edgar Evans was the first member of the Polar Party to die on February 17th, after his strength and condition had deteriorated during the return. 11 miles was a distance they had crossed many times before. Now it might as well have been another continent. The message remained inside the tent while the Antarctic winter closed over it. To understand why that final page existed, the story has to return to a moment 2 months earlier at the geographic South Pole. Scott's expedition had traveled south from its base at Cape Evans with one central ambition: to reach the pole for Britain. The journey was not a single uninterrupted march. Support parties carried supplies across the ice and then turned back at planned points. Men hauled sledges. Ponies and motor sledges had been used earlier. Every mile depended on food depots placed along the return route. By early January, Scott selected the 5 men who would continue to the pole. The remaining 4 continued north. Every lost day consumed food. Every difficult camp required fuel. Every injury transferred more work to the others. Oates's condition also deteriorated severely during the return journey. By the middle of March, he had died. The remaining 3 men continued. Scott, Wilson, and Bowers traveled approximately 20 more miles after Oates disappeared. They were exhausted, low on food, and suffering from the cold, but One Ton Depot was now close. On March 18th, Scott wrote that they were 21 miles from it. The distance was small compared with what they had already crossed. On the outward journey, 21 miles had been a demanding but manageable stage. Now each mile required hours of effort. Scott's diary became a record of narrowing possibilities. The temperature dropped. The wind strengthened. His right foot was failing. The last fuel in the stove stood between the men and thirst, because snow had to be melted before it could be drunk. Still, they moved forward. By March 20th, they had reached a point only 11 miles from One Ton Depot. Then the weather closed around them. A continuous gale drove snow across the ice. Outside the tent, direction and distance became almost impossible to judge. The depot was near, but it was not visible. The three men prepared to leave whenever the weather allowed. They waited. The gale continued. Each day inside the tent consumed what remained of their food and fuel. The situation created one of the most haunting measurements in exploration history. 11 miles, not hundreds, not even 20. 11 miles between the tent and a depot containing the supplies they needed. But distance alone does not describe movement in Antarctica. There were no roads, no landmarks, and no shelter between the tent and the depot. A person stepping into the storm could lose direction within moments. Weakness reduced speed. Frostbite made every movement harder. Without enough fuel, even reaching the depot might not have guaranteed recovery. The men could see none of that from inside the canvas walls. They could only hear the wind. Scott continued writing. He prepared a message to the public, attempting to explain how the expedition had failed. He wrote letters to family members and friends. He wrote to people who might help the dependents of the men who had died. One final letter was addressed to Kathleen with the words, "To my widow." The wording revealed that Scott no longer expected to deliver the letter himself. These documents were not written as private thoughts alone. They were written for unknown future readers. Scott could not know who would find the tent. He could not know whether snow would bury it permanently. He could not know whether the papers would survive cold, moisture, and time. Yet he kept writing because the written record had become the only message he could still send. There was no wireless set in the tent. No aircraft could cross the ice to reach them. No rescue party knew their exact location. The words would have to wait beside them until someone arrived. On March 22nd and 23rd, Scott recorded that Wilson and Bowers were unable to start. There was almost no fuel left and only a small amount of food. He wrote that they had decided the end would come naturally. They still intended to march for the depot if there was any opening in the weather. The opening did not come. Then, on March 29th, Scott wrote his final diary entry. He recorded that the gale had continued since the 21st. He noted how little food and fuel they had possessed days earlier. He wrote that every day they had been ready to begin the final 11 miles. Outside, the drifting snow continued. The handwriting ended with a simple statement that he did not think he could write more. Then came his name, R. Scott, and below it, the final request. For God's sake, look after our people. The date on the page is probably the last day Scott wrote, but the exact moment when each man died is not known. After that entry, the diary became silent. At Cape Evans, the rest of the expedition had no way to hear that silence. They knew the polar party was late. They also knew that the Antarctic season was turning against any search. Earlier, Apsley Cherry Garrard and the dog driver Dmitry Garoff had traveled south with supplies to One Ton Depot. They waited there for several days, but they had limited dog food, uncertain orders, and no knowledge of Scott's position. At that time, Scott's party was still much farther south. Cherry Garrard eventually returned to base. He would question that decision for the rest of his life. But the information required to locate Scott did not exist. But the physical page still carries the conditions in which it was made. Uneven handwriting, limited space, a sentence that stops because the writer believes he cannot continue, and one request placed below a name. For God's sake, look after our people. Those words are often remembered as Scott's last message, but the real silence came afterward. For nearly 8 months, no one knew the page existed. The wind moved over the tent. The depot remained 11 miles away. And the final message from the expedition waited in the dark for someone to open the archive. On November 12, 1912, the men found the tent. Snow had built around it. Inside were Scott, Wilson, and Bowers. The search party recovered diaries, letters, records, personal objects, and the geological specimens the men had continued hauling even during the desperate return journey. Those papers changed the meaning of the discovery. Without them, the expedition might have been remembered only as a disappearance somewhere between the pole and the base. The diary created a day-by-day record. It showed the discovery at the pole. It recorded the deaths of Evans and Oates. It described the weather, the injuries, the shrinking supplies, and the final camp. Most importantly, it carried the last message out of the tent. The search party did not move the 3 men. The polar party had no means to transmit its location. The support team could not see through hundreds of miles of weather and ice. By April, those at Cape Evans understood that Scott and his companions were almost certainly dead. But the Antarctic winter prevented an immediate recovery. Darkness settled over the region. Temperatures fell. The tent, the bodies, the letters, and the diary remained where the storm had stopped them. For months, Scott's final message had no receiver. It existed physically, but not socially. No family knew the exact words. No government had read the appeal. No public knew that the expedition had reached the pole and found the Norwegian flag. The story remained sealed inside the snow. A search party finally left after winter. They lowered the tent over them, covered it with snow, and built a cairn above the site. A pair of skis formed a cross. They searched for Oates, but did not find him. Then they returned north with the papers. The message that Scott had written in March finally began its journey to the people he had named only as our people. Letters were sent to families and friends. The diary traveled back from Antarctica. News of the expedition reached the wider world in February 1913, almost a year after the final entry. The public response was enormous. Scott and his companions were remembered as symbols of endurance and sacrifice. But the diary also became part of a longer argument about planning, transport, leadership, weather, and the decisions that shaped the expedition. Some readers saw heroic endurance. Others saw preventable failure. Modern historians continue to examine both. The final message does not settle that debate. It was written by a man inside the disaster, explaining events as he understood them while his strength was disappearing. That makes it powerful. It also means it must be read as testimony, not as the final word on every cause. The original diaries are now held by the British Library. Many of Scott's final letters and other expedition records are preserved by the Scott Polar Research Institute at the University of Cambridge. Photographs, journals, maps, equipment, and personal objects survive in museums and archives. The message no longer depends on a tent in Antarctica. It has been copied, published, digitized, exhibited, and studied.